Y'all about to get it in. The Making of the White Man by Paul Guthrie. History, Traditions, and Teachings of Elijah Muhammad. Alright, this book goes into uh, the making of the white man and white people. Alright, so we're going to get right into it. Making of the White Man. Dedicated to his Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam. 1992. Contents. Chapter 1. What is this book all about? An overview of ancient history. Chapter 2. History and the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. Traditional accounts used in the study of ancient history. A search for similarities. Real history symbolically told. Chapter 3. Scholars who agree. Religion acknowledges the existence of men before Adam. Chapter 4. Adam represents a group of people. Adam made by a group of people. Adam means white man. Chapter 5. White man driven from civilization. Ancient writings agree with Muhammad. Preserved in the Shahnameh. Recorded in the writings of Diodorus. Facts consistent with the story of Adam and Eve. The book of Adam and Eve. Outlined in the history of the jinn. Sent to the Caucasus Mountains. The Caucasian people. Reenacted in the Atonement in the caves for 2,000 years. Acknowledged by Tibetan Buddhists. Chapter 6. In the hills and caves of West Asia. The walls of the Caucasus. The desert bandits. Oral traditions of the Caucasus Mountains. Life inside the caves. The land of the Manzadaran. Whites referred to as devils in ancient Egypt. Musa and the conclusion and references. Alright. Chapter 1. What is this book all about? This book examines a series of events that took place long ago in and around the region of the Near East. Those events included the disruption of civilization, the sudden arrival of white people in the vicinity of the Caucasus Mountains, and what happened 2,000 years later when they unexpectedly came out of the hills and attacked the centers of civilization. By examining these events, we will be able to better determine to what extent the facts of history agree with the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. An understanding of the material offered in this book depends, in part, on the reader's familiarity with some of the more important trends that occurred in the history of the ancient world. Chapter 1 starts off by offering an overview of those trends. In this way, the first chapter is intended to re-familiarize the reader and to present him or her with an outline of the facts upon which the rest of this book is based. Afterwards, we will begin to examine how all of these events relate to the teachings of Muhammad. An overview of ancient history. Between 6,000 and 7,000 years ago, signs of disruption began to appear throughout the ancient civilizations of the Near East. For nearly 1,000 years, the cultures of that region underwent a change, a period of regression. The historical record shows that large groups of people moved into and out of the region. Hold on, y'all. Let me get my chargers plugged into this phone so the phone don't die. All right, there we go. As chaos. Okay, the historical record shows that large groups of people moved into and out of the region. As chaos and dissatisfaction grew, problems intensified, and the ancient societies of the Near East slipped deeper into despair. Then, about 6,000 years ago, the inevitable happened. Civilization fell apart. What caused the breakup of civilization 6,000 years ago? Many experts have tried to address this issue, but so far no clear explanation has been found. Some historians had speculated that a natural disaster such as an earthquake or some similar event took place, but they were unable to find any evidence to support their claims. Besides, all of the clues pointed in the direction of an event quite different from that of an earthquake, a condition that grew over an extended period of time. The picture is one of communities in turmoil, of societies collapsing and falling apart from within, of chaos, dissatisfaction, and unrest. The most accurate summation would be to say that the people just began fighting and killing one another. This is the best way to describe what was happening in the Near East 6,000 years ago. Soon after the unsettling of civilization, another interesting change began to take place. This change occurred in the area of the Caucasus Mountains. There, in West Asia, a previously unknown group of people suddenly appeared as if from out of nowhere. Collectively, they are known as the Indo-Europeans, Caucasians or white people. The facts show that they first entered the area around 6,000 years ago. 2,000 years later, their invasions would bring them into contact with the civilized nations to the south. But as to where they first came from and how they finally ended up living in West Asia, very little appears to be known, because they had no fixed homes and wandered about from place to place. Historians usually describe their way of life as nomadic. The ancient world, Chester Starr talks about their lack of culture and their uncivilized way of life. As for their language and uncertainty, and this uncertainty surrounding their place of origin, Starr said of them, quote, "Since they were so backwards, it is very difficult to use archaeological evidence to help pin down the original home of the Indo-European tongues. No specific patterns of physical culture can be attached to the languages, and they were written only after their speakers came into contact with who? With civilized folks. They didn't have their own languages. They didn't get their own languages till they came to the south and met the dark-skinned people, right? So with the arrival of the Caucasians into that cold and sparsely populated area of the world, the few older communities which earlier had been established there in Europe were either abandoned or destroyed. The evidence clearly suggests that the original inhabitants of those settlements either fled or were killed off by the newly arriving whites. In an article appearing in the Journal of Indo-European Studies, Professor Marija Gimbutas talked about the arrival of the whites and the subsequent disintegration of what she calls Old Europe, the farms and villages that had existed in Europe before the arrival of the white man. According to Gimbutas, after the whites showed up, drastic changes started to occur in the region north of the Caucasus. Explaining how those changes signaled the arrival of the Caucasian, Gimbutas says, quote, "A time period around 3500 BC forms a caesura between Old Europe and Indo-European Europe. It is a time when life in the large villages and townships either stops or is markedly changed. It is at this time, the first half of the 4th millennia BC, that the first eruption into the Danube, the longest river east and west in Europe, and the northern European plains of the Kurgan let you know that they're the relation to Mongolians and the Mongols, right? Kurgans, or Proto-Indo-European peoples from the Lower Volga, Lower Don steppe is dated. Gimbutas, 1970. The degenerative changes in the settlements of the old European civilization may be assumed to indicate the beginning of the Indo-European presence. Following the breakup of the ancient societies and the arrival of the white man in Europe, the people of the Near East worked to reestablish the level of peace and security they had once known. Slowly, over time, communities were rebuilt, prosperity was restored, and signs of new life started to emerge. In Africa, along the banks of the Nile River, Egypt blossomed into the Pyramid Age. In Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, the Sumerians too established a civilization renowned for its high level of culture and refinement. Even as far away as India, along the tributaries of the Indus Valley, the Dravidians constructed the magnificent twin cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. Rich in arts, sciences, and the necessities of life, these civilizations laid the foundations for trade and finance, architecture, geometry, mathematics and astronomy, philosophy, law and government, writing and religion. Sounds like Freemasonry, doesn't it? That's a building right there. That's some building right there. Throughout the period of Reconstruction, building, reconstruction, rebuilding. Not much. You have to have the knowledge to rebuild something. You have to have been the original people to have the knowledge to rebuild what was already built, not outsiders. Throughout the period of Reconstruction, not much attention was being paid to the nomads from the north. The threat never seemed significant. From time to time, a few nomadic bands would wander down into the centers of civilization, but their activities never amounted to more than occasional raids or skirmishes. In the course of time, small groups of the whites were able to establish camps along the hills and deserts outside of Mesopotamia. Although such camps survived mainly by robbing and scavenging, their overall impact upon civilization remained minimal. Most of the whites were at that time still beyond range up in the hills. In the book The Chalice and the Blade, Riane Eisler, the internationally known scholar, talks about the distant presence of whites and the low level of concern activities invoked. On page 43, Eisler explains, quote, "At first it was like a proverbial biblical cloud, no bigger than a man's hand, and the activities of the seemingly insignificant nomadic bands roaming the less desirable fringe areas of our globe. Over a millennia, they were apparently out there in the harsh, unwanted, colder, sparser territories on the edge of the earth, while the first great agricultural civilization spread out along the lakes and the rivers in the fertile heartland. To these agricultural people, enjoying humanity's early peak of evolution, peace and prosperity must have seemed the blessed eternal state for humankind. The nomads no more than peripheral novelty," right? So they were living in a golden age before the white man came. That's what's talked about all throughout history, right? A golden age long ago, before the invaders from the north. But the Caucasians of the north were not to remain a distant novelty forever. 2,000 years after their arrival, the nomadic tribes began to move away from what for years had been their home. As they swarmed down out of the hills, some of them began to travel west toward the Aegean Sea. At the same time, another larger group, see, this is when they began to split up. Some became Europeans, some became Tajiks, some stayed in the area, they became Mongols, stayed Mongols, and they spread out. Some, that's, all the way through Alaska, Korea, and all the way down through the Bering Strait into the Americas. That's why you have the same genetic code in Siberia as you have the Native Americans, because this is their home. This is If you're not black, if you can't claim the black nation, Siberia is your home. That's your genetic home. That's where they all come from, West Asia, Central Asia, Siberia today, right? So they split up. This is where they were splitting up and becoming different peoples, right? But they have the same root. So at the same time, another larger group trudged southward in the direction of the centers of civilization, right? These are the ones that went straight down south into India and started conquering the Dravidians, right? And created the caste system, right? This is where it all goes back to, right? The unforeseen mass movement of white people out of the hills of West Asia was generally been looked at upon as a historical mystery. Why? Because they want to cover it up. They don't want you to know where they come from. That is why most historians agree that Chester Starr, who in his attempt to explain it, characterized the white man's unexpected awakening this way. Quote, for unknown reasons, the group went into a ferment shortly before 2000 BC and started spilling out all over Europe and Western Asia. As they moved southwards, they were joined by smaller, taking up positions along the hills and caravan routes outside of Mesopotamia. As they advanced towards the centers of civilization, they began a series of violent. So complete was the effect of the onslaught that when it was all over, nothing was left standing. In a book, A World History, William Hardy McNeill outlined what took place. On page 43, Professor McNeill tells us, quote, during a period of about 300 years, beginning soon after 1700 BC, the civilized world was overrun by barbarian conquerors, hill peoples living north and east of Mesopotamia, tribemen of the desert fringes of Syria, Palestine, and northern Arabia, together with wide-ranging war bands originating from the northern steppe, combined with varying portions to attack all existing centers of civilized life. The range of these barbarian conquests was in at two extremes that if you look at the early history of civilization, we find that all of the centers of civilization near East Africa, Mesopotamia, and India underwent a severe fall about the same period of time. Every historian agrees that the uprooting of these civilizations were the result of attacks from white who came rushing down out of the hills of West Asia. In India, Mohenjo-daro was sacked and its people were enslaved or killed. The outcome was the same of those of Mesopotamia and Egypt too. The extent to which the nomadic tribes overran and subjugated civilization is echoed in the writings of Immanuel Velikovsky, who described what the whites did in Egypt by saying, quote, a cruel conqueror invaded the once mighty realm. Now overthrown and prostrate, he subjugated it without meeting resistance. He desecrated its sacred palaces, he raped its surviving women, creating the mixed breed children that take over. That's how they start doing it. They rape, they come in and they rape people. They have mixed breed children and they put those children in power. And they go back home and they leave those children in power in the new places that they claim and take over. That's how they always have done it. Right? That's why they always come in all peaceful. They send one or two peacefully to the original. Right? That's what they've always done. They still do it today. He utterly destroyed the temples. If any remained erect, robbed the sepulchres of the dead, mutilated the victims who remained devils. Ancient accounts, some of which were written, clearly illustrate the gloom into which ancient society had fallen. Such eyewitness accounts demonstrate how the white man came in and violently usurped the ancient cultures by turning the wealth and sophistication of those cultures into his own. You see, it wasn't his own originally. It's stolen, right? This same thing they're doing today. Stealing black culture, stealing black history, all of North Africa. That's why they're trying to rewrite North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Libya, all these places. They're trying to whiten history because that's how they steal. That's how they've always done it. Still doing it today. One such document, the Admonitions of Ipu Wer, this is a real document, was written in Egypt right after the white man had gained control over the land. The account describes the invading nomads, crude and cultureless barbarians who forced population and then destroyed the inhabitants of their possessions. Regarding these matters, the admonitions of Ipuwer reads, quote, "Barbarians from outside have come to Egypt. The children of nobles are dashed against the walls. The storehouse is stripped bare. Its keepers stretched out on the ground. Behold, now something has been which has never happened. He who never even slept on a plank, who never wove for himself, is now the owner of fine living. Behold, she who once looked at her face, quote, the population laments bitterly the catastrophe which has overtaken the city lies in ruins. In India, the conquering horde known as the Aryans came down out of the hills. That's where you get them coming down that area. That's where you get all the Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all Pakistan, all the stands, right? And then you go farther to the Caucasus Mountains. That's where you get the European, more European type, right? See, farther over, they're more Turkic type, and the farther over you get, the more European they get, right? The farther west you go, the more European they get, right? That's how they spread out westwards, and they spread out eastwards and came to the Americas, right? But they're all originally Siberians, Turkic Mongols, right? So this is where they came straight down south from Siberia, Turkey, came straight, Turkey, originating Mongolia area. Some skin colors. This is a caste system called caste system. There you go. According to the system, the whites were the rulers, and the darker-skinned Dravidians turned into slaves and outcasts. Huh. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, priests were turned into slaves, and other dark-skinned persons were relegated to menial positions or were pushed back away from the areas of trade and commerce which they originally ruled. See that? Everything was stolen. The new way of life was drastically different, and anything that had existed before it was the beginning of the white man's rise to power. All right, that's chapter 1. We're going to end it right there. We're going to start chapter 2 next video.